Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going back to Reconstruction in Virginia.
Definitely a fascinating time, full of change.
A lot going on back then. And we know that our listeners are particularly interested in the evolution of civil rights and really those power dynamics, shifting after the Civil War.
Yeah.
And to really get into that, we've got a ton of sources here, historical excerpts, images, even everyday objects from back then to really paint a clearer picture. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting look into this era. We've got legal documents, political notices, even some personal items to try and see the complexities of this time.
Okay, so why don't we get started with this image? A 31-star U.S. flag. You see it flying over Richmond, April 1865, right as the Civil War is ending. What a moment.
Yeah, it's a powerful image.
Yeah.
Symbolic, really, of Virginia being brought back into the Union, the end of this conflict, and, a new chapter. But for Black Americans in Virginia, this is just the beginning, this long road to equality.
So it's a promise, this flag, but also so much left to do.
Mm.
And you see that tension play out even just a month later. We've got accounts from Norfolk, Black citizens, they go to vote. This is May 1865. And they're turned away. It's a right they just fought for.
Absolutely. It shows this immediate pushback, even though the laws are changing, the social and political realities, well, they take time to catch up.
It's so symbolic, I guess, that freedom on paper.
Yeah.
It doesn't always equal freedom in practice,
Well,
but we do see some positive steps, some glimmers of hope here too. The Constitutional Convention, 1867, 1868, there are 24 Black delegates elected.
yeah, and that was a huge moment. They played a crucial role in shaping that new Virginia Constitution.
Mm.
They were really instrumental in advocating for public education, which had been denied to Black people for generations.
To have a voice in the very government that had denied you rights, I mean, that must have been an incredible feeling. But then we also have this notice issued by the Black community in Richmond, 1866, and they refuse to celebrate the failure of the Southern Confederacy. They see it as God's doing, God liberating them.
Yeah.
What does this tell us, this act of defiance so soon after the war?
I think it speaks volumes about their agency, their perspective.
Yeah.
This wasn't about celebrating a military defeat. This was about claiming their rightful place in a society that had kept them down for so long.
So even with the setbacks, there's this powerful sense of hope
Mm.
and determination.
Yes.
But then we come across the Vagrancy Act of 1866, and
Yeah.
this law targets anyone unemployed. But how did it specifically impact Black communities?
Well, it was this loophole.
Mm.
To keep control over Black labor. It didn't say race explicitly,
Right.
but it disproportionately impacted Black citizens. Just think, you're duly freed, trying to find work,
Yeah.
and you're criminalized for being unemployed. This act really undermined freedom, and it created something very similar to forced labor.
It feels like an attempt to reinstate those conditions of slavery, almost. And then it makes the federal government's intervention with those Reconstruction amendments all the more important.
Absolutely. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they were designed to enshrine those freedoms, the ones being undermined at the state level. So 13th Amendment, that abolishes slavery officially. The 14th, that's equal protection under the law. And the 15th guarantees the right to vote for Black men.
Let's not just list them, though. Let's really unpack these. How did these amendments actually reshape the power dynamic, both in Virginia and nationally?
Well, one really interesting outcome was the way it changed Southern representation in Congress. Before the war, enslaved people, they were only counted as 35 of a person when it came to representation.
Yeah.
The 14th Amendment, that recognized them as whole individuals, which actually increased the South's political power.
That's fascinating. So you have this increase in power for the South,
Yeah.
but also this growing Black electorate that could actually challenge the way things are.
Exactly. It created this complex dynamic with potential for change,
Yeah.
but also this very real fear of Black political power among white Southerners. And that tension, that fueled a lot of the resistance we see during Reconstruction.
Speaking of that power, we know that between 1869 and 1890, there were about 100 Black representatives elected to the Virginia General Assembly. That's incredible.
It is.
Were there any figures who particularly stand out during this time?
Yeah, a few come to mind. You have Dr. Daniel M. Norton, a physician and a big advocate for Black civil rights and education, and Edward David Bland, who worked closely with the Readjuster Party.
The Readjuster Party, can you explain who they were, what they stood for?
Yeah, it was this really interesting group, Black and white Virginians who wanted to, as their name suggests, readjust the state debt from the Civil War, and increase funding for public schools. They were a pretty big deal in Virginia politics for a while.
And we have this broadside here, advertising a ratification meeting for the 1870 Constitution in Nottoway County. And it was organized by both Republicans and readjusters.
Wow.
Isn't that remarkable to have these two groups, with their different supporters and ideologies coming together?
It really highlights what was possible during this time with these biracial coalitions. This kind of collaboration was so important for getting progressive laws passed. But it also shows how fragile these partnerships were. The Readjuster Party, they eventually split under pressure from, white conservatives and those who felt their reforms didn't go far enough.
Progress, it never moves in a straight line, does it? It's always that push and pull. And we see that with the arrival of the, quote, carpetbaggers. And we actually have a photo of a carpetbag right here. It's just a simple travel bag, but it's taken on a whole other meaning.
Absolutely. Carpetbagger. It was used to put down Northerners who moved south after the war, painting them as opportunists coming to take advantage of the South. But the reality is more complicated.
So were they villains, heroes? Were they just there for the opportunities, or were some genuinely trying to help rebuild and make things fairer?
It's important to remember they weren't all the same. Some were drawn to economic opportunities, wanting to capitalize on the South rebuilding. Others, they were idealists, committed to civil rights and racial equality. And some were both.
So a mixed bag, really, a variety of motivations and impacts. But their presence, their influence in shaping new Southern governments, that definitely fueled resentment, especially from former Confederates. And this resentment, it plays right into our next chapter, the rise of the lost cause myth. We've got a collection here, these Confederate reunion badges, and they're quite ornate, almost like medals. What did these badges represent?
They weren't just, souvenirs. They were really symbols of this whole movement. This lost cause narrative starts to emerge during this time. It romanticizes the Confederacy, downplays the role of slavery in the war, and these badges, well, they were like physical reminders of that effort to kind of rewrite history.
It seems like a very deliberate attempt to reshape that narrative of the war and its aftermath. So how did this lost cause myth, how did it affect the progress made during Reconstruction?
Well, it was really powerful in shaping how people remembered the past.
Yeah.
And it was used to justify that return to white supremacy. It fueled the rise of groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who actively pushed this version of history through textbooks, monuments, public events and all that.
So it wasn't just about remembering the past. It was about controlling the narrative to influence what's happening now and what happens in the future.
Exactly.
What was the impact of this on Black Virginians specifically?
The lost cause. It directly led to the dismantling of a lot of those Reconstruction-era reforms. It fueled the disenfranchisement of Black voters, things like poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and it also provided a justification for those segregationist Jim Crow laws that would impact the South for decades.
It really shows the power of a narrative, especially when it taps into those deeply held beliefs and prejudices. And it makes the resilience of the Black community during this time all the more remarkable. We have a photo here, a horse-drawn hearse, from the Black-owned A.D. Price Funeral Home. It's quite an image, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It speaks to that resourcefulness and determination of Black communities. They were facing segregation, excluded from white-owned businesses and services, so they had to create these parallel economies. And this hearse, well, it represents that self-reliance, born out of necessity, really.
So while the lost cause narrative is trying to erase Black agency, trying to bring back white supremacy, Black communities are actively building their own institutions, their own spaces,
Absolutely.
their own economies. Did these parallel economies offer some sense of hope, opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. These Black-owned businesses, schools, churches, and social organizations, they provided these essential services. They helped build community. They cultivated Black leadership and entrepreneurship. They were safe havens from the racism and the violence happening in the larger society.
It's that reminder that even when facing oppression, there's that drive for self-determination. But sadly, those forces of white supremacy were gaining ground. And by the 1890s, Reconstruction had essentially ended. What led to its demise?
There were a few things that happened all at once. Support in the North started to fade.
Right.
The country was dealing with economic problems and political scandals. And the federal government, under pressure from Southern Democrats, they slowly pulled back their military presence. They stopped enforcing those civil rights protections as much.
So a combination of political maneuvering, economic factors, and just a loss of will to keep pushing for those hard-won rights. That must have been a devastating blow for those who'd fought so hard.
It was a huge setback, and the consequences were immediate. The Democratic Party, who had been kind of sidelined during Reconstruction, they took back control in Virginia. And that started almost a century of one-party rule. And this shift in power, it has a massive impact on the state's future.
Which leads us to the Constitution of 1902. It's known for tackling corporate corruption, but it also severely restricted black voting rights. How did this Constitution really solidify white supremacy in Virginia?
The 1902 Constitution was a real turning point for Virginia. While it did address some concerns about corporations having too much power, it also made disenfranchisement part of the system. Poll taxes, literacy tests, all these discriminatory measures were put in place,
Yeah.
and they took away the right to vote from black citizens.
It almost feels like they were rewriting the rules of the game to guarantee a specific outcome. Did anyone challenge these unfair rules?
Yeah, there was some resistance,
Yeah.
but it was mostly silenced or ignored. Black leaders, activists, organizations, they fought against disenfranchisement and segregation. But their voices were often drowned out. And the legal system, now controlled by those who benefited from white supremacy, they upheld these discriminatory laws.
So it wasn't just laws changing, it was a whole system shifting to make it nearly impossible to challenge how things were. It's like a sad echo of those early days in Norfolk when black citizens were turned away from voting.
It is. It's this tragic cycle. Progress, then regression. The advancements made during Reconstruction were systematically taken apart, and this set the stage for decades of Jim Crow segregation, white political dominance in Virginia.
And this wasn't just a Virginia story, was it? This was happening all over the South.
Absolutely. The end of Reconstruction was a turning point for the entire country. It solidified racial hierarchies, and it delayed that promise of equality for generations. It's a period that continues to influence how we understand race, power, and justice in America.
It's hard not to see the connections between what happened then and the conversations we're having today about voting rights, about representation, about systemic racism. It feels like we're still dealing with the unfinished business of Reconstruction, in a way.
Yeah, those echoes are definitely there. Those tactics to take away voting rights from the Jim Crow era, the debates about Confederate monuments and what they represent, the fight for racial justice and economic equity, all these issues have roots in the legacy of this time.
It's like we're still trying to answer those big questions that came up during Reconstruction. What does real equality actually look like? How do we build a fair and inclusive society? And how do we deal with the shadow of slavery and its legacy?
Those are tough questions, and they're
Oh.
still challenging us today. But by looking at the complexities of Reconstruction, its successes and its failures, we can get some valuable insights into how to address these challenges in our own time.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. We started with that image, that 31-star flag, a symbol of hope and a fresh start. But that journey to equality, it was anything but easy.
It wasn't.
We saw those steps forward, like the election of those black delegates to the Constitutional Convention. But we also saw those steps backward, the Vagrancy Act, the rise of that lost cause myth.
And what really stands out to me is the resilience of black Virginians during all of this. They faced so many obstacles, but they organized, they fought for their rights, they built institutions, they created communities. Their determination laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement years later.
It's a story that's both inspiring and heartbreaking. They accomplished so much, only to have it taken away. It's a reminder that progress, it's not guaranteed. It needs our attention and action all the time.
I agree, and it's a lesson we should keep in mind as we navigate these complex issues of race and equality in America today. The fight for justice, it doesn't end, and we all have a part to play in building a more equitable future.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Reconstruction in Virginia, what's the most important thing you want our listener to walk away with?
I think the key takeaway is this. History isn't just a bunch of facts and dates. It's a living story. It shapes who we are today, and it guides our future. By exploring the past, by understanding its complexities, we can understand ourselves better and the challenges we face as a society.
I like that. And for our listener out there, we hope this deep dive made you curious to learn even more about Reconstruction, not just in Virginia, but across the country. Think about how the themes we talked about, political power, civil rights, the struggle for equality, how they still show up today.
They're all around us in our laws, our institutions, our monuments, and those conversations about race and justice that we're still having. And by understanding this history, we become more informed citizens, working together for a future that truly reflects equality and justice for everyone.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. through this really important chapter in American history. We hope you'll keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep engaging with the past as we all work toward a more just and fair future. It's hard not to see the connections, between then and now. Those debates we're having today about voting rights, representation, systemic racism, it's like we're still dealing with what wasn't finished during Reconstruction.
Yeah, the echoes are there for sure. Those tactics to take away voting rights that were used in the Jim Crow era, the arguments over Confederate monuments, what they symbolize, the fight for racial justice and economic fairness, all these issues, they're rooted in what happened during this period.
It's like we're trying to answer these really big questions that were raised back then. What does true equality mean? How do you actually build a society that's fair and inclusive for everyone? And how do we face, that shadow of slavery and all that came after?
Tough questions. Questions that continue to challenge us. But by understanding Reconstruction, the good and the bad, it gives us some perspective, some tools maybe to address these issues today.
This deep dive has been, well, pretty eye-opening. We began with that image of the 31-star flag, hope, a fresh start. But that road to equality, man, it was bumpy.
It was.
We saw progress, like those black delegates being elected to the Constitutional Convention. But then, steps back, the Vagrancy Act, the whole lost cause myth taking hold.
And throughout it all, you see that resilience of Black Virginians. So many obstacles, but they organized, they advocated, they built their own institutions, their own communities. That determination, it laid the foundation for the civil rights movement that came later.
Inspiring and heartbreaking at the same time. To see those gains taken away, it shows us that progress, you can't take it for granted. It takes work, it takes constant attention.
It does. It's a lesson we have to remember. As we figure out these issues of race and equality in America, even now, that fight for justice, it never ends. And each of us has a role to play in making a future that's truly equitable.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Reconstruction in Virginia, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away?
I think the big takeaway is this. History isn't just a bunch of facts and dates in a book. It's alive. It shapes who we are today. It influences our future. By exploring the past, by wrestling with its complexities, we understand ourselves better. We understand the challenges we face as a society.
That's a great way to put it. And for you listening, we hope this has made you want to learn even more about Reconstruction, not just in Virginia, but everywhere. Think about those themes we've discussed: political power, civil rights, the fight for equality, how they're still relevant today.
They're all around us, in our laws, our institutions, even those monuments we see, and those conversations we're still having about race and justice. When we understand this history, we become better citizens. We can work together towards a future that's truly equal and just for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through such a pivotal point in American history. We hope you'll keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep engaging with the past as we work together to build a better, more just future for everyone.